And I think in this way, sensor technology could help you to get actually a new perspective, or you could say a more nuanced perspective about your everyday life, about your stress.
Welcome to the Stress Navigation Podcast. In this podcast, we'll talk about stress, science, and daily life. We'll interview experts in the fields of psychology, psychiatry, physiology, genetics, sociology, data analysis, and much more. Hello, listeners. For this next episode, you might notice that the audio is a bit different. And as a disclaimer, we wanted to say that the room we booked to record it was a bit too big. So I think you'll notice that as you're listening. And because of that, maybe the quality of the audio is not as we would like it to be. We're sorry about that. However, we had a really great chat with Matthijs that we couldn't keep this episode from you. We hope that this little mishap won't keep you from tuning in. And I think you'll get used to it pretty quick after just a minute or two. So please enjoy listening and thank you for being here. Hello, everybody. We're back at the Stress Navigation Podcast. And today we are talking to Matthijs Noordzij, a professor of health psychology and technology at the University of Twente, one of the leading universities in the development of remote assessment technologies and human technology interaction here in the Netherlands. Matthijs' research focuses on how we can best use technologies like smartphones and wearables to monitor people's health and hopefully provide useful knowledge for self-management. Given that smartphones and wearables are everywhere in daily life, I find Matthijs' expertise to be extremely relevant to the world we live in. Thanks for being here, Matthijs. How's it going?
Yeah, pretty good. Thanks for coming all the way to Enschede from Amsterdam.
It's really great. We get to tour around and meet different people. So we just really like your research. So that's why we contact you. And I would like to dive right in. And I would first like to know, what are sensing technologies? I just mentioned smartphones and wearables that can monitor health. So the name is sensor technologies. What are they and what do they measure?
Yeah. I mean, it's a broad term, Marcos. So I think we could talk about many things. Like a sensor could be something in your room that senses humidity or rain outside. But I think for my research, sensors are often something something that's worn on your body. So it somehow senses something from maybe your behavior, so how you're moving, how you're walking. But some of these sensors also allow you to say something about what's going on inside your body. So somehow measuring your heart rate or skin conductance, things like that. So it can be many different things, but for my field, health psychology, where we really want to promote healthy behavior by people, also tracking their behavior. It's often about sensing something from the human, if you will. But this is also evolving. And so a sensor could be classically seen as something in your watch maybe, but it could also be something just in your t-shirt and become more and more invisible also. So that's also something that's of interest to me.
You mentioned evolving, and it makes me think what the history is of this, how it started, kind of the first sensor technologies, and where we're at now. You're mentioning a t-shirt that also senses something, so I'm curious if you know a little bit of the history of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, we could go way back, but maybe it's good to start in the 60s in Japan, where there was this kind of a governmental push towards more movements, so people should walk more, something that's still relevant, I think, today. And they were really pushing this pedometer. So it was a sensor that you clipped on your belt, and that could somehow move track your steps. And people were invited to take 10,000 steps, which is still a goal we are aspiring to today.
Where did that number come from, 10,000 steps?
Yeah, I think it was just a marketing guy at a marketing agency. So it was one of the best guesses in the world, but because I think big cohort studies have shown that taking 10,000 steps is actually a really good idea and kind of a cutoff point above which you don't really get much more. But okay, so in terms of health psychology, health behavior, in the 60s in Japan, that was really a start, you could say. But another thing, if you think about sensors, you could think about hearing aids, so something that you put in your ears and that senses sounds and amplifies them. I think, for a long time that has been one of the most successful wearables and sensor technologies in one. And it kind of, muted, if you look today, to people wearing like their AirPods and things like that. I think that's the biggest category nowadays of wearables. And if you look at other things in sensor technology, actually one of the examples I really like the best, I think, in terms of sensing and wearables and kind of helping people also with their connection and sensing something in their body, is the hug shirt. I think it came out already 15 years ago, and you could kind of give yourself a hug then, and then someone else who was also wearing that shirt, maybe across the nation, could feel a hug. So this is an example where maybe the sensor is sensing your own intention almost, what you want to do, and then someone else feels some pressure from a shirt, and that that gives you this feeling of a hug. And I think about 10 years ago or something, we really got this big boost in sensing through smartwatches. That's also where really my expertise lies. You get the Apple Watch and things like that, which include sensors that allow heart rate measurement, not only steps, but also heart rate. And then that evolved into also doing sleep tracking for consumers, which is of course something we can dive into more in terms of how valid are all those measurements. But I think those are developments that were really relevant to me, where I'm interested in this relationship to psychological experience on the one hand, and these objective measurements of steps, of heart rate, of our nervous system. And with these wearable devices, these sensors on your body, you can really start to look at that in daily life.
So in your research, you try to mix objective measures with more subjective experience. That's why it's health psychology. How does this translate into a research project or into a study that you've published lately? Do you have any examples?
Yeah, for sure. I think maybe it's good to go back when I started in Twente, and I really got here. My background is in cognitive neuroscience. So I actually came here studying brains, and then realized I wanted to move more into daily life research, measuring emotion, communication as people meet each other in daily life. Then you cannot measure the brain, right, in an ambulatory way, although nowadays they are trying that with EEG, but
it's not like you can easily put a cap on your head, not like a watch. This is more seamless,
exactly.
Right?
So I came here and I thought, well, I'm still interested in this relationship between our body, our brains, and our psychology, our cognitive processes, our emotions. But I cannot use my fMRI scanner anymore. And at that time, MIT just produced their first wearable sensor that measures skin conductance. It's called the Q sensor. And on the wrist, you could measure the conductivity of the skin.
And what does that represent?
I mean, it's an interesting measure because it's really only representative of the sympathetic part of your nervous system. So that part of your nervous system that gets involved when you get stressed, when you get more energized. So you could also say just your arousal levels, your energy levels. So that's interesting. If you can start to measure that in daily life, it's a pure measure of the sympathetic nervous system. So I was aware of this new wearable, and at that time, a healthcare organization here in Twente approached me with a rather particular case where they had patients who were intellectually very challenged, you could say. So they had like the cognitive abilities of a 1-year-old, so really low, but also really challenging behavior. So they could get very emotional or even aggressive. And they said, don't you guys at Twente have something to know about what's going on in these people in a different way, but then just by looking at them. And you had like trained healthcare professionals looking at these people, sometimes one-on-one care, and they still had a very hard time in seeing these aggressive incidents occurring. So they could be surprised suddenly by someone becoming very emotional. So then this question arises, by measuring the physiology, using a wearable, using sensors, can we open up a different window, if you will, a different insight into these people who cannot talk about it very well themselves. They have nonverbal behavior. What you then start to do, of course, you do a research where you videotape people for a long time wearing the sensors. You also videotape the professionals, and you see, you check whether the signals you get from the skin conductors in this case are predictive of these aggressive incidents. If that is true, then of course you can start building monitoring technology or warning technologies so that professionals get like a warning, hey, maybe there are rising levels in the skin conductance indicative of maybe more sympathetic nervous system activity, which is predictive of
an aggressive behavior. Yeah.
So I think that's really something that got me kickstarted, I think, here in Twente, and questions I'm still working on, because you can already imagine all kinds of problems arise when you try to do this kind of thing. Maybe one thing that I should highlight out of this research is we found actually, I think that's also relevant for other things we'll mention, that often we don't even have to predict. So we found that people were aggressive or harming themselves. Of course, you can see that in the skin conductance levels. That's not very surprising, scientifically speaking. But no one was there, so they were alone. So we said, well, if only there would be a warning system like in the situations where there is already danger in a sense, and that a healthcare professional then is alarmed and comes, that could be already helpful. The actual prediction of aggression is more difficult. So to look into the future with these signals, I think is more challenging. But there we already found a potential use case for the technology.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And it makes me think of all the health problems that can be tackled with this, because I wasn't even aware that you could use it, for example, with intellectually challenged people and aggressive behavior. I know we use it in the field of mental health to track your emotions. I know people use it if they have a heart problem. So tell me a little bit more, some other health issues that you can tackle with this.
With the wearables, or with the sensors.
And this kind of, I'm also interested in this predictive thing, so we'll get to it. Maybe each problem has a different way of tackling prediction.
Well, another aspect I've been involved with is not with people with mental retardation, but people who are diagnosed with personality disorders. And what they indicate often themselves is they kind of feel no emotion whatsoever, so nothing, or a 100%. So they feel like overwhelmed by emotions. And one of the things where you could use wearables, or what we're trying out, is if you can let people experience more the gray areas, if you will. If you measure your heart rate for a week, it will fluctuate quite a bit, but actually most of the time it will be quite boring, you could say, kind of in a middle range. So can you give people feedback on these physiological signals? People who actually have indicate themselves they have very little emotional awareness, very little awareness of their physiology, and on the one hand, kind of prompt them maybe when they have really high levels of physiological activity, surprising in terms of their normal bandwidth, if you will, of their signals, but also inform them that actually most of the time life is pretty boring, you could say. You're kind of in a middle range. So I think that's an interesting, different example where it's really not about a warning signal for a healthcare professional, but it becomes more into the realm of also self-management. So you get sensor information, and can you integrate that in your therapy, into your thinking about yourself in new ways? And that's of course challenging.
Yeah, is skin conductant enough to be able to give this information, for instance?
Well, enough for what?
Well, enough to predict aggressive behavior, or enough to tell someone something may be happening with your emotions.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's a crucial question. What does it need to replace? So you're measuring physiology. You're interested in someone's emotions or the management of your emotions. Can you say, well, these are pretty straightforward in a way, and if your heart rate goes higher in certain scenarios, then it's okay to warn you. You're probably, you have some kind of conflictive emotion. And what we find is that this is really not a good idea. If you look at the research in terms of the association between all kinds of emotional states in different contexts and fluctuation in skin conductance, in heart rate variability, all kinds of things kinds of parameters you could get out of sensor data, then that's really problematic. Sometimes these things are just zero, so there seems to be no correlation, especially in daily life measures. So I think it's a really bad idea to have a simplistic substitution of your emotional classification from sensor data. But what I do think, and what our research I think has shown a little bit already, is that this idea of a generalized BioQ could have some potential.
What does this mean, generalized BioQ?
Yeah, so you take, I mean, I would say this is already implemented in some of the smartwatches, maybe not in a great way, but it's there. So you take a baseline reading of someone. Let's say you measure for a day, a week, maybe a month, and you get some insight into fluctuations of your physiological responses, of your skin conductance, of your heart rate. So that will be quite varied. And then you only start alerting people when you go above this individual threshold. Mm-hmm. So that would be a BioQ in the sense like, hey, wow, this is for you, what we know about your physiology, an interesting phenomenon in a way. Mm-hmm. Are you aware of this? And that could be like a first basic question, like in your bodily system something has occurred. And it might be, of course, be totally trivial because you're very enthusiastic about something. You're completely immersed in, I don't know, playing music or something really happening is very important for you. So yeah, you could say, well, fine, mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. But of course, it could also be surprising. Mm-hmm. And from that, you could then have a reflection that could be quite general. But if you're come into a situation where you are faced with some treatment or some challenges that you have defined for yourself in a way where you want to work on, you want to change certain behaviors that you have, then this generalized BioQ could become something like, hey, in these situations, am I making decisions that I would like to change? So to my mind, that then gives you potentially just a different channel to work with that could be interesting. I really believe in this almost individual co-design for yourself in your life. Mm-hmm. From a nerd perspective, if you will, you could say that's kind of hacking your life. So many people are working on that already, I think. But I'm a little bit more interested in bringing that phenomenon to a population that might not be considered like nerdy or actually mm-hmm. Intrinsically interested in data or technology. But I still feel that might be an opportunity.
And if we do healthy levels of self-reflection, everybody could benefit from that.
Yeah.
Or is that your experience? Do people enjoy this interaction with the technology, or in your studies, do you find people who don't like it at all?
Well, for sure. I mean, there are people who don't like it at all, especially I would say actually professionals. So I mean, on the one hand, I work a lot with patients struggling with healthy problems and looking at sensor technology in their treatment. But I also work a lot with professionals that need to think about how technology fits into treatment. And I would say, if you mentioned the hesitation part about technology, I would say I meet a lot of professionals who are hesitant about using technology and also sensor technology in treatment.
What are the hesitations based on?
Several things I would say. Very basic, I would say training. So I work a lot with mental health care professionals. I'm also involved in training mental health care professionals. And if you look at the curriculum of their training, then there's just very little technology in it right now. So there's just a basic lack of understanding how it could fit into their work. So that's one problem. Another problem I think is feeling it doesn't really fit into their line of work. So if you think about mental health care, stress management, thinking about yourself, talking to other people about it, there's this sense that this is a human affair to do this. So then you bring in sensor technology and it measures some data, yeah, how does that relate to this very personal experience?
And what do you say when someone brings up that question?
Yeah, well, I mean, on one level you could say it's trivially true. I mean, there is an aspect to human experience that is just a first person experience. So no amount of data will convince you otherwise, you could say. If you feel bad, you have a sense, or you feel stressed, hey, you label that yourself, and say, oh, so. And then technology comes in, or a data stream says, no, you're totally fine. In some sense, you could say, well, that doesn't work, right?
Mm.
On the other hand, of course, you could say, is that the only thing that matters in life? Like your first person experience of stress, of what's going on. And I would say, no, it's also a limited view in a sense. And I can give you a concrete example. It's actually an example a clinical psychologist gives often, whom I work with a lot, where we use some, let's say, generalized biocues in people who are dealing with eating disorders. And well, you're wearing a sensor, you're eating your dinner, you're struggling with food, so that's can be a very stressful situation. You actually experience first person stressful situation. The thing beeps. Totally, yeah, you're validated, you could say. It's also a bit superfluous. But then the eating moment is over. You go through your day, and then this patient can indicate, oh, when I had such a bad traumatic experience with food again, my whole afternoon is destroyed. I just feel panicked, anxious, it's terrible, I blame myself, you name it. But then you're wearing your sensor, and 5 minutes after the eating moment, while still having very difficult thoughts, the sensor indicates you're in your boring zone, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And so your physiology has actually returned. And this is kind of on case study level. You could indicate that's very invalidating. This thing is broken.
Would you call that a mismatch?
Well, what I have to say maybe is now not so relevant. What the patient then, several patients have indicated, is that they say, oh, that's surprising, actually. I kind of discovered something new about my body, that my body is more calm than my thoughts are right now. Mm-hmm. Which, if you look at therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, of course, a lot about is working with your thoughts and getting a different perspective on your thinking. Mm-hmm. And I think in this way, sensor technology could, I'm not saying it always does, could help you to get actually a new perspective, or you could say a more nuanced perspective about your everyday life, about your stress, where previously it was kind of just all folded together. Like I have a bad eating moment, I have high emotions, then my whole afternoon is destroyed, and I was just very stressed. But now suddenly this eating moment where indeed your physiology was much heightened, your thoughts were very bad and difficult, and the afternoon where still you had very difficult thoughts, but actually your body was calmed, it becomes a different situation, still difficult, but different.
Yeah.
So you could work with it in different ways, and I think that can be interesting for a therapist, but also for the patient themselves to work with that.
Well, I think what you're getting at is contextualizing, right? I think we all know people in our lives who, when they're really feeling their emotions really strongly, they're so deep in it, maybe it's not the time to tell them, hey, take a step back and see how good things are, for instance.
No. Yeah.
But still, that's in the end what people do, right? They end up, when the episode is past or the bad moment, they maybe take a step back and they look at things in context, and they're able to say, well, okay, I still have this is going well, or maybe they feel grateful for other things. And it's interesting how this technology can help also contextualize. Maybe you're having a really bad moment, but then you look at your bodily measurements and hey, maybe it's not all that bad.
Yeah. I've now been quite positive. So one thing that's also coming up now, talking to you, if you look at the current consumer market where they have watches that indicate stress scores, when I tell people I do that kind of research, the first thing they always say to me is people get so stressed. You have a stress wearable, you have more technology. Mm-hmm. Actually, if you look at the studies we do, then the big problem is actually that people just don't care. So they disengage from the technology. The biggest worry is that people will get stressed, but I think the big problem is that people just don't care. Mm-hmm. So in a way, they don't maybe feel empowered by the technology. They don't have a belief that by working with the technology, it could actually help you. So I think, sometimes that's actually a big challenge to get people who might also not even be that empowered in feeling that they can actually work on their health goals, don't really strongly connect to long-term health goals, like cardiovascular health, mental health, because it's obvious that you want to be healthy. But maybe that is actually not true for everyone. So how do you then bring in technology to start playing a
Well, that's
good
not a
role?
real finding, right? People who recover are the ones who also are open to being helped and recovery. So it's interesting how technology just fits in that narrative as well.
Right.
Maybe for some people it's scary or not, but then the question of how do we bring the technology in so that people develop this belief that it can be helpful, that it shouldn't be stressful. It's a big question. Yeah. Are you also doing this kind of research more subjective experience of people on asking them how they feel about the technology, how it best integrates into their life? Because I bet it's also very different for different people. So.
Yeah, I mean, for sure we've done this research also with healthcare professionals, with patients. But my experience, if you just do an interview and talk to people about it, people are quite positive. And they kind of see the benefits, like, it would help me track my sleep or my steps. Healthcare professionals can also be positive. What I think we need more is actually daily life studies where we, over longer periods of time, track people interacting with their wearable. And I've done one study for 9 months, where we interviewed people after 3 months each time when they were wearing a simple step tracker and sleep tracker. So it was a couple of years ago, which is a basic consumer wearable. And one of the ideas we wanted to tackle was, do people really abandon it after 3 weeks? Which is kind of this idea, which a lot of studies seem to suggest, like, you have some novelty effect, but most people will discard it. But when we tracked them for 9 months, we actually found, moments where they did discard it, but then they started returning to it. So they had this feeling like, I got some insight about my sleep. Now I know I don't have to wear it anymore. So you kind of learn something from the technology, and then you leave it because you don't feel you can learn more. But then it turned out it also has a kind of prosthesis effect, that it seems to give you something that you then forget again, or helps you remember, maybe to go to bed on time, because these things also give you these kind of prompts. So that was interesting to see that they had these engagement, disengagement, re-engagement. But that was with, I think something like 15 people working at a consultancy firm. So typically there are people that are quite interested in their health, they're quite health literate. So I think we also need more of those studies in other populations that don't care maybe that much about long-term health. And how do they then engage and disengage with wearables?
And I was just going to ask, I bet it would be different for someone maybe with more of an obsessive compulsive disorder to constantly receive feedback, or someone, I just read a paper with heart patients, and within a community of heart patients, there was already different types of people. The one who would use it playfully, maybe because they didn't have so much symptomatology, but other heart patients did have some dizziness, so then it was a bit riskier when abnormalities in heart rate were present. So it's also interesting that different populations might react differently to the technology, and even within populations you find different people. How do you tackle that? Just the fact that there's just so many people to interview or know about in their relation to technology.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's complex, of course. So I cannot claim I've done that many different populations. But one of the things, maybe in my research, I kind of gravitate towards is looking at very maybe challenging populations, where you could say, well, if it works with this group,
the room to grow is also
the room to grow is there. Where you also have sometimes surprising discoveries, like if I mentioned the group with the intellectual disabilities before. So we had to do an extensive ethical review for that study, if you can imagine. And these people are vulnerable. So we made a whole protocol where in the end they might be able to actually attach to wearables themselves. So in the beginning the healthcare professionals had to help. And there was some skepsis, I think, and cynicism even, like, oh, these people will never be able to, they will destroy it maybe, they won't like it. But I think in the end of our first round of experiments, everyone was actually quite proud, all the clients, in taking the technology and wearing it themselves, actually enjoying it, even doing like a band for heart rate measurements themselves on their body. So yeah, you can also sometimes be surprised, I think, in terms of, let's say, maybe difficult groups liking technology if you introduce it in the right way. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is something we need to work on more, I think, with groups that are maybe in the middle a little bit. So they don't care too much about their health, they don't care too much about technology. How do we make them, in a good way, interact with these kinds of sensor technologies? Where I really feel most of what we have now is geared towards, if I put it flatly, runners.
Yeah, basically. Basically.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad to hear also that there's ethical considerations being done here, because there's a lot of, I think, transformative power in the technology. Letting people know about themselves can really change how they view themselves. And you also got to be careful with that power, right? So it's nice to hear that that's something that you consider in your research.
For sure. And I think maybe also taking a step back, we've really jumped, I think, to complex use case scenarios, which I'm interested in. But I mean, one of the things that also always pops up when you work with these wearables is the validity.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's get into this. Is also specifically in the context of stress and action, for instance. So we do stress measurements.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what things you measure with stress in your research. What are the components that are relevant to include? And then, what is a valid stress measurement?
Right. Yeah. So focusing on the wearables and the autonomic nervous system, I'm really interested in the physiological stress response. And what you depend on then are heart rate measurements, skin conductance measurements that are already mentioned. And we know if you measure at the wrist the skin conductance, then this signal is really quite degraded compared to measuring at the finger. And the finger is the preferred location. Interesting. Where skin conductance in a way is a really simple signal. It's kind of a wavy signal, slow waves, and then when you have a sudden jump scare, you're watching a horror movie or something, you really see this sudden rise in skin conductance. You can even feel it. I think even when we're having a conversation and there's something interesting, you can almost feel it in your skin, and you feel the conductance changing.
Yeah.
So really simple, lovely signal, and then you measure it at the wrist, and anyone who's done that, used a wearable to do a 24-hour measurement at the wrist. If you first look at it, you're really appalled, I think. So you really see a lot of zeros, and it seems like it failed. Then someone runs up the stairs, they start to sweat a little bit, and then suddenly the signal kicks in. So I think it's important, if you're claiming to measure stress in daily life, or trying to measure stress in daily life, that we are very precise on how good the wearable is that we're measuring. So how does it compare to this gold standard? That's a very simple comparison. Measuring at the wrist, how does it compare to the finger? But then more difficult, could it still be good enough for, if you measure someone for 3 months? It's a bad signal, there's a lot of noise in the signal, but could it still, because it kicks in when people might get very stressed. All the time it's kind of a very poor measurement, but someone then gets into an argument with their partner, an extended argument over days, you have a bad relationship with someone. You actually have high levels of perceived stress, your body is really reacting to this in a chronic way. And suddenly the skin conductance measurements are picking this up, compared to a zero measurement, a bad measurement earlier. And I think that's a much more difficult validity question. So something we'll be working on in the stress and action program.
Yeah. Are the consumer wearables that are out there nowadays, Fitbit or Apple Watch or No Watch or the Aura Ring, also people use rings, are they valid enough for the purposes that we want, like connect to health outcomes or not?
I think the political, strategic, scientific answer here is we will keep checking that. And so we promise to have a wearable database the next 10 years where we will collect all the papers on a given wearable. What do they find in terms of the accuracy of the signal? For the best ones, so the ones that really come on top, you could say, we'll also do our own tests. So both in Amsterdam and Twente, we have labs where people are stressed out, you could say, through social tasks, so suddenly giving a presentation in VR or in real life. And then seeing how do these wearables compare to the gold standard, but also taking them out of the lab for 2 weeks and maybe comparing them for 2 days of those 2 weeks to the gold standard, also ambulatory, but also checking how wearable are they really? Do people really are able to wear them that long? Is that comfortable? And from that, we will give our own advice and judgment on these wearables. And I think that can be quite nuanced in terms of what you could advise and which one is the best. If we look at existing studies, then steps, that's not directly the autonomic nervous system, but steps are okay, although still can have some variation between wearables. Sleep is problematic, especially sleep phases. I mean, the time in bed can be kind of okay. And then heart rate, especially if you would average over, let's say, 5 minutes, can be pretty good. Skin conductance, as said, can be problematic. So correlations as low as 30% with the gold standard. But of course, these things might improve.
Well, this makes me think of a person that I asked on the street, because we do this. We go on the street and we ask people what their experience is with stress, in this case with using a wearable that tracks their health. And I wanted to play it to you and maybe start up another discussion from what just this person says.
Yeah.
So I asked them, what wearable do you use? What does it measure? And what is your experience using?
Yeah.
On my Garmin watch, I have 2 types of measurements. The first one is for measure sports. That's one of the reasons I bought it, for like going running and also all type of sports. I use it just for running. And health data. It measures me like my heart rate, body battery, stress level, and sleep health. I use it usually more like as a curiosity. I think it's not necessary to focus just on those data because there are a lot of things that the watch can't measure. I think it's good just to have it and look it, but don't stress yourself because of those results.
I think that's an interesting answer. It tackles a little bit about what we've been saying, that mostly consumer devices are directed towards runners, that maybe it just measures a couple things and it doesn't measure all of it, and how to relate to that technology. It makes me think of this idea of curiosity and how to relate to the technology like that. And even if it's not extremely accurate or it's not yet totally valid, there's also just something we can say, hey, this technology is not there yet, but it can be a way for you to look into yourself and do it. And what did you think? What are your thoughts?
You would say this is a really healthy response to a wearable. You could also say he started out with, I use it for my sports tracking. And that's, of course, the consumer group where these wearables are made for. But then, being kind of subtle about the other measures, like the body battery and these derived scores where it's a bit unclear what it's actually measuring. And that's also a critique, of course, where you could say, it kind of seems to indicate, like it indicates your general stress level. While we know stress is multidimensional, has many aspects, and it's just measuring some form of cardiovascular activity and making a stress score out of that. So you should have a little bit of a hands-off approach to that score, exactly what this person is indicating. I've also done studies for 2 weeks where we asked many people this kind of questions, and you do also find this response quite often, especially in the student population. But you also find people who are totally discard it, say it needs to completely confirm my own ideas, else I don't believe it. Or people say, I'm really unsure about my own feelings. Even kind of having the feeling, I don't have any emotion, or it's very difficult to classify. So I start trusting on this completely, where you feel, well, okay, that could be useful, but also a miscalibration. So I think in stress and action, where we claim to, in the end, build better stress management tools, we really need to be open to these different users and different user scenarios, and how to almost help people to calibrate in a, also scientifically sound way, in terms of what we know about these signals, but also a personally meaningful way, and a healthy way.
Well, a framework that you talk about that I like, that I wanted to mention, is the framework based on compassion. Right. So given that there's so many users out there that might react so differently, a good way to implement this technology is with compassion. And this is a research that you do, compassionate technology. So what does this mean? How do you define compassion in this context?
Yeah, so you now bring up another big topic where we could talk for another hour.
Yeah.
So let me limit myself severely here. I mean, you could look at it in different ways. A basic way here with these wearables, you could say currently the intention is to push you towards more steps, to push you towards more sleep. So there's this drive towards improvement, self-improvement, which I'm not debating. Which is an interesting intention to put into technology. If you say, well, what would compassionate technology be about? I don't think that's necessarily in contrast to it, but it allows for a first step where you say, you kind of listen, stop and listen, like what's really going on now in an individual. And it might be that there's a situation where you say, well, get off your butt and start moving. Sometimes that's a compassionate. That can be relevant. However, often I think in people who are suffering from physical or mental health complaints, that can be totally off in terms of what you say. And sometimes you just need to listen to someone and give someone some time to rest, or explain their problems, empathize with that. So I think the core of compassion is to have this recognition of suffering, of what's going on. And in many technologies, I find there's this intentional engineer mindset of let's fix the world, which is great. I mean, we need that mindset. It's an essential mindset. It's a creative mindset. It's an inspiring mindset. However, not everything in life is something that you can solve or always need to solve.
In my experience, at least with partner relationships, the classic thing of like someone shares their problem with you, and you're like, okay, let's try to fix it. Maybe the only thing they need is for you to just listen and then give them a cup of tea and just be there, right?
Right. So in terms of compassionate technology, one way to look at it is as a challenge almost. Can we make technology, software, coaching strategies that are a bit more flexible and have different perspectives, and not just let's fix it. And given that many engineers also work on the software, I think there's now an overrepresentation of that one mindset and that one way of addressing the problems of the world, where there could be others. So compassionate technology is a way to trigger people maybe to think about different perspectives.
So not just an engineer, but in the technology design, bring in a caregiver, or in the person themselves that's going to use the technology.
Yeah, I mean, originally it was actually not aimed at engineers, to be honest. It was actually aimed at the caretaker who felt like technology has no place in stress management, in dealing with depression. Where you could say, it's all about compassion, it's about me feeling for the other person. But then you could also say, well, compassion is actually also a process. Like recognizing suffering, recognizing problems, recognizing someone has been in bed for 2 weeks. A wearable can do that.
just location, right? They can track location.
For example,
Movement,
and the caretaker is not always there. And of course, the Netherlands is very small, but in the world we have countries that are very large where a lot of people don't have healthcare around them. The only thing they have is their smartphone or maybe a wearable. So in that sense, technology can actually be a crucial element in compassionate care. And the conviction that compassion is purely human is actually a hindering conviction. So I also use it as a wedge almost to discuss with healthcare professionals a way in which technology can actually boost compassionate care.
Well, it's also, I also feel it's a bit, I don't know if the word is incorrect, but it feels, if something doesn't feel right to think that technology is something separate from human.
Right.
Of course, if you see it more like science fiction, there's a robot there. Yeah, that clearly feels different, but technology is inherent in human development and creation. Even cooking would be considered technology, right?
I mean, technology at its basic level is just a way in which we use natural phenomena to address our needs and wants.
Yeah.
And I would say compassion technology is then, we want to recognize suffering and relieve it. So let's use natural phenomena, to address that, and maybe anger, because you could say, I want to be very angry or feel my anger. You can also use natural phenomena for that.
It's what they say. It's not the technology that's maybe the bad thing, it's how you use it. Of course, the intentions maybe behind a certain piece of technology, it's different to, I don't know, say I'm going to create a gun, then I'm going to create a watch, right? It's different types of technology that have different intentions, like you say, put into the design.
Yeah.
But I do like this definition of just a way of using natural phenomena to address our needs and perceiving the world around us as well.
Yeah, and maybe if I could give a final twist on the term, there are some researchers that are actually letting people use their compassionate voice to technology. So you actually comfort your AI. Sounds a bit weird, right?
Tell me more about that.
So let's say you have an AI and that starts to say that they're actually sad, and you're invited to think about how would you console this technology. And it turns out that is actually very healthy behavior.
It's an exercise.
Like in healthcare, you could say, the patients are being helped and the doctors have to work so hard, it's so difficult. But maybe the doctors are also benefiting from giving compassion. So in that sense, you could also see compassionate technology as a practice for having a certain mindset towards the objects in the world. And you might actually feel better. You're compassionate to your
That's funny.
Yeah.
Well, this is I really love this topic, Matthijs. Really, thanks for talking.
We just started, right? Now we're going for the next hour.
To end, I would just like to ask you, what would a perfect scenario look like for you? If you had the most fruitful way to engage with technology in your field of health psychology. Like a dream. What would it look like?
Right. Well, I would say that it would involve a group of people who at present would not care too much about long-term health goals, is not really very active in let's say, positive ways of self-care, and that we then introduce our SIA toolkit, whatever it may be, let's say in 6 years, which empowers them in a way to connect to long-term health goals. So they start seeing that as important. And in addition, our measurements actually give them relevant cues, maybe once a month, once a week, to signal them like, hey, now you should really reconnect to your long-term health goals. There's a bit of a risk. And it fits their needs instead of, let's say, the already healthy people who are validated by the current technology. That would make me really happy.
Well, that was great. Thank you so much. And I hope the listeners learned something new today about technology and how it's being used in the current days with health and stress management. And we will be here next time with another interesting episode, another interesting guest. Thank you for your time, Matthijs. Thank you for listening.